All right, so I'm here with Kevin. We're going to take a look at 7-Sage core user Sherman Act 1890's prep test results. A bit of contextual information about this 7-Sage user. They've been on the core plan for several months now. Their initial PT score was in the, say, mid/high 150s, and they've been taking prep tests about one prep test a week. So we're going to take a look at their two most recent prep tests. One they got a 166 on, and the other one they got a 163.
So let's start with reading comprehension. One thing that is very clear from the timing is that this person is not keeping their passage times under control. So we have a passage 1 that is taking over 12 minutes. We have over here a passage 2 that is taking over 12 minutes. And it's possible some of that may be because the person is coming back and at the end and using that time. But it seems to me what's happening here, if we look at the timing more specifically, is the passage read is happening so quickly that they end up needing to go back to the passage on almost every single question. Some questions are taking 2 minutes, multiple questions are taking over 1 minute. And that's what's causing them to end up using all of this time. Here we have a passage read that's about 2.5, which it's not so bad standing alone. But if you look at each passage read time, it's coming in here. This is coming in at 1.5 minutes. On passage 4, we have 2 minutes. So like the average passage read time for this person is probably about 2 minutes, 2 to 2.5. And in my experience, that's just too low to really get a top score. If you're looking at people who are getting -1 on RC, -2 on RC, on average, they're taking longer. It's more like a 3-minute passage read time, maybe all the way up to 4 sometimes. And so I think this person would benefit from just making sure to do the fundamentals of reading an RC passage, breaking down, doing low-res summaries between each paragraph, actually stopping to think about it, thinking about the relationship between the first paragraph and the second paragraph, stopping before they get to the questions to summarize the main point. Taking all of those steps it's going to add 30 seconds. It's going to add maybe even up to a minute to their process. But what it'll give them is a much, much stronger understanding of the passage, such that they might have been able to get some of these questions correct. So maybe a better understanding of the passage is what was required in order to get number 6 here correct. Maybe a better understanding of the passage is what's required to get number 22 here correct, which they were able to get on blind review. But is it possible that they could have gotten it correct within the parameters of a 35-minute time section? I think so, with a better understanding. JY, you have anything to add?
Yeah, this is just feels like we're echoing similar advice that we've given in the previous analytics analyses that we've done. And the reason is because it's a very common problem. And the reason that it's a very common problem is, I think, because it feels scary to spend time up front in the passage. But it really is an investment. The better you understand the passage from a structural level, the faster the questions will go. So Kevin mentioned that, yeah, some of these questions that this user got wrong on actual take, but they got right on blind review. Perhaps they could have gotten it right had they had a better understanding of passage. I would just add to that, the other benefit that's subtle is that they could have gotten faster. They could have gotten the questions that they did already get right. They could have gotten them faster had they had a stronger understanding of the passage from the beginning.
Yeah. The other thing to add on RC is when we click into their actual take, it seems like they make liberal use of the underline feature.
Oh, right.
It suggests to me that and notice that essentially everything is underlined, almost everything. I suspect that the underlining is done as the person is reading. So the underlining is not necessarily like a reflection that the person does after they get to the end of the paragraph, thinking about, what's the most important or what's indicating author's opinion. So if I'm right about that, that this is basically just an underlining as they read, I would encourage this person to experiment if they haven't already, because I think that if they just put in the energy that they use towards underlining, towards thinking about the passage, towards reflecting on each paragraph, doing the things that we talked about when it comes to breaking down the passage, that's probably going to be better for their score. Now, this isn't to say that they should stop doing this. They need to experiment. I know for some people, underlining or just using your mouse to go over the words as you're reading is a way to just stay engaged and to make sure you're picking up the language. So if that's the tool that the person if that's a way the person is using an underline tool, that's okay. But I would encourage them to experiment here because this is highly unusual pattern of underlining here. I think it may even be harder to figure out what's important. Maybe the reason they took so long on some of these questions, even if they ended up getting it right, is because their underlining is nonsensical. It's not really highlighting what is likely to be tested or what's likely to be most important. So I would encourage this person to experiment with being more judicious about underlining.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I suspect that the underlining is being used as a kind of like a safety blanket. It's just a comfort thing, right? As you read. I mean, I do this with my mouse when I read. I would just put my mouse and I would just kind of go over this. Sometimes I would use the browser highlight where you just select something, but not the actual highlighting tool, right? So the difference is that when you use a browser highlighting, it's ephemeral. It goes away right after you click something else, right? So that's fine. It helps me focus. It helps me stay engaged with the passage. But the difference is that after I'm done with the passage, I don't leave behind a bunch of just seemingly random underlines or highlights. And I do think this kind of distracts. This seems to me like it's noise. It's not signal, right? When I'm trying to go back to the passage to find what's important, this this underlining seems to be more distracting than helping.
Yeah, notice this paragraph. It's basically the whole paragraph is underlined except for one, two, three, four, five, 6, 7 words. So
Right.
uh, this isn't to say no one should underline, but I think this person should think a little bit more about how they want to use underlining, and if it is being used just to stay engaged, and they find that this is the best way to stay engaged, then that's okay. But I strongly suspect that this person is not necessarily experimented with other ways to use underlining or highlighting.
Okay, so high level for RC, our advice is to slow down with the passage, spend more time on the passage, understand the passage, really practice this, what we teach in the core about like when you reach the end of the passage, pause for a second, absorb do a low res summary of the paragraph you just read, and try to anticipate what the next paragraph is going to be. And then as soon as you read the next paragraph, the first line, the first sentence of the next paragraph, try to throw a hook back to the previous paragraph. Ask yourself, how is this paragraph connected to the one that I just read? So that way you form a thread, you form a structural thread moving through the passage as you read it. That absolutely will take more time. And that's a good thing because we're seeing from the analytics that you're not spending enough time on the passage. And as a consequence of that, you're spending too much time on the questions and you're probably getting fewer questions right than you could have gotten.
All right, now on to logical reasoning. So the first broad observation before we get into some specifics, at least for me, is I think this person is not necessarily moving on as fast as they should. And I'll state that
Right.
more
Yeah.
more directly. They should be moving on more quickly because
Let me
this is
let
a
me
good,
put it a
yeah.
different way. You're getting sucked into time traps. That they're time sinks that you're not recognizing, and you're just getting sucked into it. Your score right now, like the goal, I don't want you to. I don't know if implicitly this is what you're thinking. I suspect maybe somewhere subconsciously this is what you're thinking, but let me just put it out there explicitly. You're not trying to get a 180 here, right? You're trying to get a consistent high 160s. Um, Score slash maybe break into the 170s. That's the goal, right? So I want you to be very clear eyed about that. And a consequence of being clear-eyed about that is recognizing that there are questions that you get to miss, because that's what it means to get a 170 score. That's what it means to get a 168 score. It means you're missing, whatever it is, like 9 questions, 11 questions, right? Depending on the prep test. But that's not something to like to be. That's not a bug. It's a feature, right? It's something to embrace. It's a constraint to embrace. You want to approach your sections like, yeah, I get to miss like, say, 4 questions on this section, right? That mindset gives you the freedom to jump out of time sinks faster, right? Because Kevin was pointing out, I think here's another one, right? Here's another time
Yeah.
sink.
Well, yeah, these are two. And the thing to notice about them is not just that they ended up taking a really long time and that this person got them wrong on the initial take. It's also that they got it right on blind review. And so that suggests it's possible that if they actually moved on more quickly once they realized it was tough and maybe came back at the end of the section, they would have had their chance to look at the problem with fresh eyes. And then they maybe would have gotten it correct within the parameters of the time section because they just got their chance to do blind review essentially in the middle of the section. But that's not going to happen if you end up spending 3 minutes just on the first time you see it and you just think about it straight through. There was probably just something that they were missing. They misinterpreted the conclusion, misinterpreted an answer choice, and whatever they figured out in blind review, they want to give themselves a chance to figure it out in the times situation by moving on. I think once this person flagged it, they should have moved on at that point. That would have saved another at least a minute, right? And maybe that same minute, even if they ended up spending that same minute on the same question, but they just did it later after they came back at the end, who knows? That may be what it was required to realize what they were missing.
Yeah, something else that we noticed. So this pattern of getting sucked into time sinks shows up in a lot of different places in both prep tests on many sections. There are questions that, just as a generic rule of thumb, procedure could be the moment that I flag this question is the moment that I move on, right? So we saw several instances of that, right? So here's another example of that,
Yeah, right here.
where just moving on would have been in net better, right? You move on, you flag it, you move on, because it's not like you don't lose the time. You're just banking that time away, right? You still get 35 minutes for the whole section, just how you spend that time.
And even though here we're looking at one that ended up taking 2 minutes and 40 seconds, they ended up getting it right, which is, it seems like then great. That was time well spent. Not necessarily, because you can see that they realized this was a tough one very early on. And it's possible that if they just moved on and then came back later with fresh eyes, that they would have ended up at the same place and they wouldn't necessarily have been stuck on A for what looks to be almost a minute.
Yeah. So something else that we noticed, and this actually came out of analytics. Kevin, if you could switch to the priorities tab. The top priority for the students conditional reasoning, and that makes a lot of sense. We saw a bunch of questions where either they did end up getting it right, that was conditional reasoning heavy, or they didn't get it right. But in either case, they spent a lot of time. In fact, more time than we think they should have. We don't really know why. But, I mean, we can speculate. Kevin, I think you had a theory about just sort of not fully committing to,
Yeah.
like, kind of waffling on like whether or not to map it out.
Yeah, this is a good example of one. So you can see that they got it wrong during the initial take, and they took about 2.5 minutes. It looks like they didn't really come back to it. So all that time was spent just on the initial take. And what ends up happening in this problem is it's pretty much a standard quantifier inference, intersecting set inference type of problem involving sum and all. And based on how this person has solved it, it seems like they probably didn't diagram it, because if they did, then I don't think they would have been stuck in this way. They wouldn't have been leaving these answers open. There would have been a very clear inference to make. So the fact that this person was able to get it right on blind review, though, suggests to me that maybe they did diagram it on blind review, in which case, if that's what happened, I feel like they should embrace diagramming in the time situation when the problem is the kind that calls for it. It looks like I have to filter back to conditional reasoning. But so that's one possibility is they did diagram later, and that's what helped them solve it in blind review. I would encourage them to try doing that in the time situation. It doesn't take as long as many people fear. What ends up happening is if they try to approach these heavy conditional logic or heavy quantifier-based problems without diagramming first, it can still end up taking 2.5 minutes, and they get it wrong. Imagine if they just realized, hey, this is one where diagramming is going to be useful. I'm confident in my skills. I'm just going to buckle down and do it. And they probably would take less than 2.5 minutes, and they would probably get it right, as shown by their blind review. This is not the only time where something like that has happened. I think here's another example of one of these questions where I think diagramming would be useful. You don't have to diagram it to solve it, but I think it can be useful. And if this person did diagram the problem accurately, they wouldn't have been stuck between the answers they were stuck between. And the fact that they were able to get it right on blind review, as you can see right over here, does suggest that they can get this kind of question correct. So I don't know if what I'm suspecting happened really did happen, but it is a common problem that high scorers have, which is they feel like they don't have enough time to diagram the problems that they know diagramming would be helpful on. So they attempt to solve the question, let's say, intuitively. And if you're successful with that approach and it doesn't take that long, then great, you can continue that way. But this person is clearly not. And so I think it would help to embrace diagramming and to, if they're not confident enough in their skills to do it in time situation, then it's worth specifically focusing on that, because basically high scores would view a question like this as just like an easy question. It's just not one
Yeah.
that you want to miss.
And I would strongly recommend doing drills that are conditional reasoning heavy with sufficient assumption questions and must be true questions. Those are the ones that are just sort of the most heavy on formal logic. Embrace mapping out the logic, embrace diagramming, but don't think of it as the end state, right? Like I know I get the sense that you're trying to rely on your intuition, and that's great. And I think you can. I think what will happen if you practice more with diagramming is that you will necessarily sharpen your intuition. You will get stronger on conditional diagramming, and then at some point, for some questions, you're going to realize I don't actually need to map this out on paper. I can just see it in my mind's eye, right? And that is the goal. That this practice of physically mapping it out on paper, diagramming, this practice is a way to get us to that state where you're just more clear-eyed about like what the logical relationships are. And that's of course a great state that we should all be striving towards, right? Because you get the question right and you get it right fast.
Yeah. So I think if this person practices conditional logic, embraces diagramming, even in a time situation, that's the path towards improvement. They can definitely pick up at least a couple more points on each section if they handle diagram-based questions. And diagram-based questions is not even the right way to put it. It's just questions that are based on conditional logic, quantifier logic, where you have, let's say, more than just one or two statements. You have to connect multiple statements together. Sometimes you have to interpret a statement in the contrapositive form. A lot of this is just difficult to do if you're trying to just keep it all in your mind. And you might feel you're able to, maybe sometimes you are, but it would be way easier to get better at using the tool of diagramming. And as JY said, when you get so good at it, it eventually just becomes part of your own intuition.
Yep. So good luck.